less entertainment. But the story there is that, you know, in addition to teleporting to Mars, he was also...
We're live at Devils Tower. Richard Beckwith is talking. I'll get you over there. If you have questions, let me know, and we'll ask the panel.
Participate in this program, we call it 20-year account, where you're in the program for 20 years, and then after 20 years, you are age regressed and sent back to the same period of time from which you were taken. In order to buy those kinds of stories, you really have to be pretty open-minded, I guess. You know,
to the point where your brains are falling out.
And I talked to a guy who, I did talk at a conference in New York City. I talked to a guy that was
Now I'm filming.
Being very cagey about what he's able to do, and I'm not going to mention his name, but he came up to me and he said, "Oh, I go on alien ships all the time," and then he went blank for a minute, and he goes, "I just came back." I'm not kidding, and I went like this. I went, "Say that again," and his wife got very angry with me for not believing him, and she started yelling at me, and I said, "If he says he did it, he did it." I go, "Oh yeah, okay, you know what?" And I said to them, "So you just went?" "Yeah, I went. I was there for 2 hours." "And then what?" "Well, they brought me back to the time just after I just momentarily left. You probably noticed I had a blank look on my face."
I hadn't noticed anything.
Yeah, and I was like, okay. And so what do you do with that? Okay, now put your logic hats on. Bing! What do you do with that? There's nothing you can do with it. He knows that. So, you know that they are playing you because in your mind, you know that that's probably technology that just isn't going to happen. I personally don't believe in, this time travel going either way. All right, I don't believe in that. Not at this point. I do believe in Mallett's work. Professor Mallett, University of Connecticut. I'm on a science board with him, and this guy has created a time travel machine. However, the machine can only bring you back in time to the point from which it was turned on. Okay. And he uses a special process to actually create this environment within which all the data and all the information for what happened since the time the machine started is brought online, and you can go back to any point in that timeline. And he's theorizing that you can actually do that with whole people, with memories, with vehicles, anything you can jump into at some point. That actually makes sense because now we have a virtual world that's being created by his system, right? That's sort of what I think is the best way to say it. So this virtual world is the place within which you can move. Within that limit, though, if the machine wasn't turned on until yesterday afternoon, you can only go to yesterday afternoon. And if you turn it off, oops, you lose all those days. You lose nothing. You can't go back anymore. It's nowhere to be found. That is, I think, the limit of kind of like time travel. So when someone tells me that they've gone up, and they get a blank look in their face and say, "I was just there for 2 hours," I'm sorry. I'm not there yet. Okay? My opinion.
Real quick on time travel, though. I mean, time travel is recognized by many physicists, as of course Mark I'm sure knows, as a generic feature in keeping with Einstein's theory of relativity. There are a lot of different ways, hypothetically, that it could be done. The problem with time travel is practically, it seems. I mean, for instance, in creating an environment where information can be exchanged is one thing, but the idea that a person could be teleported to Mars, or they could, carry out a military operation while they're there and then be carried back in time. Again, I don't want to name names here, but I mean, these stories sound extremely outlandish, despite the hypothetical reality and physics of time travel. The other issue, though, is that when somebody has a really sensational story, all of a sudden people are attracted to that. They say, "This is really neat. This is cool. I want to learn more about this guy." And then the people who would attack serious scientific attempts at studying UAP or unexplained phenomena, they go, "Well, this is what these folks believe." I'm not attacking anybody's beliefs, but I do want to say that I hope you can understand how difficult it is for us as researchers to have to cope with the fact that, in my opinion, there are people who are more than willing to promote, frankly, absurd ideas and say, "This is what we do." And then the broader community says, "Yeah, that's what those people do." Whereas there are at least a few of us, and I think those here present, who are serious about trying to study this, serious about trying to apply science to it. We're willing to speculate where warranted, but we don't leap to conclusions, especially conclusions that seem less than likely. especially in keeping with things like relativity in the universe. So I'm absolutely happy to concede, yeah, time travel is a generic feature of our universe and physics, whether or not we ever can practically use it. But that's not really ufology. And people who are going out there saying, with the exception of Mark, of course, but people who are trying to claim that they're traveling all over the universe and time traveling and things and calling that ufology, it's not. It's bunk. And that's damaging to this kind of work that we try to do.
The last thing I'll add to that actually is Kip Thorne's an astrophysicist who he was a consultant for Interstellar, and I remember sitting with him for like 3 hours some years ago, and he told a story about how he was in a debate with Stephen Hawking at the time, and he was debating that time travel was possible, and he explained how there was a methodology, and he went through the mathematics to show it, how you could enter a black hole and see yourself coming out of the attendant white hole, the energy, the opposite side, so to speak, of this black hole, before you went into the black hole. And that constituted a bit of like time travel, all right? And he, and Hawking said, yeah, I don't believe that, send me your argument. So he sent him his argument, and Hawking penned a return argument at the same time. His return argument, that is to say Hawking's argument for no time travel, Thorne read, and Hawking read Thorne's argument, and Thorne said, oh, Stephen, you're right. I don't think I believe you're right. I don't think time travel is possible. Then Hawking wrote back and said, actually, Kip, I think you're right. I think you can do it. I think you're theoretically right. So what's that saying? It's saying even the greatest minds on this planet can't agree yet what the right answer to that question is. Because we don't really have a fundamental understanding of time as more than just a construct of the human mind to mark off points.
You may know better. I've heard Tyson interviewing Michio Kaku, and Michio Kaku saying it's possible, but it would take an extremely large amount of energy.
Right.
And I don't it comes down to string theory. I don't get it.
Really quickly breaking it down, because Paul Davies wrote a great book about that called How to Build a Time Machine. And yeah, what you would essentially need is you would need the power of several atom bombs that could confine a lot of matter into a very dense space, and you create what's called, I think, a quark-gluon plasma. And then with this exotic matter, then what you try and do is you essentially try to widen an aperture in space-time that one could conceivably use as the beginning of a, call it a wormhole perhaps, that one could travel through. But again, the conjecture is that you would have a starting point and you could travel to a point in the future but couldn't go further back than the point at which the time machine was built, which brings us back in time to what Mark was saying.
Well, Mallet, in his word.
Yeah.
Well, I have a time travel related thing as well. In 1980, I was doing an interview with Gordon Cooper, one of America's first astronauts. And at the time, he was working for WED Enterprises, which stood for Walter E. Disney. And he was one of the research and development people for a thing called Epcot that was being developed. And I was doing this interview with Gordon. We originally were just talking about UFOs, but it somehow got moved into this other area where I asked him if there's anything else of scientific interest that he'd like to talk about. And he said, well, I have some scientist friends who are right now working on the development of a time machine. And he had my attention right there. And again, this is 1980 that he told me this. And I said, well, what's the theory behind this? How could this work? And he said, apparently it involves something called orthogonal rotation. And I still don't know what that means, but for some reason I never forgot it. He said it's the ability to get something to rotate in either one direction or another at a fast enough speed that you could somehow slip between the here and tomorrow or the here in the past. And I said, well, okay, how far along are these people in this scientific endeavor? He said, well, they're at the early stages, but they're very promising about it. And I said, okay, so are they saying you could go travel in either direction? He said, no, they don't think they've worked out that part of the problem yet. They think that it could all come down to going either in one direction or the other, but without a return trip. So I said, oh, okay, so we're talking suicide mission. So who would be stupid enough to sit in a time machine and take this kind of one-way trip? And he said, you're looking at it. Wow. It suddenly occurred to me, yeah, Gordon Cooper, one of the original 7 astronauts who all became known as the right stuff, these men who were fearful of nothing and would take any risks at the sake of whatever it was that they were trying to accomplish, whether they have families or not. He was one of those guys who the wives during all the early space missions didn't know if their husbands were ever going to come back again. And it was so dangerous, much more so than it is now. And I said, "You're crazy. Why would you do that?" He said, "Because it's something I'd want to do. The adrenaline rush alone of being able to accomplish this." And I said, "Well, okay, which direction would you like to go in? If you have the choice." He said, "I haven't decided yet." Too many paradoxes, too many possibilities, but again, that was 40 years ago.
Maybe he didn't really die.
Well, that's a possibility. So I'm curious, so I did the interview with him 40 years ago. Here we are 40 years later, speaking of time. If that project was still ongoing, have they accomplished it? Where is it now, 40 years later? I don't know.
One thing I want to say about the traversing of time, and that is something that they are looking at the To the Stars Academy. You may or may not be aware that, and well, I'm sure you would be aware that they're working with Hal Puthoff. Hal Puthoff is working with them, as well as Eric Davis and other individuals, the former director of the Skunk Works. And the idea is, with regard to these objects that they studied, that were being studied during the ATIP process, that somehow these objects are producing a gravitational field. In other words, they are producing their own gravity somehow. Now, the science would say that, as Alejandro said, that this requires a tremendous amount of energy. However, one of the things that Lou pointed out during his talk was that they have already clearly been able to produce micro black holes at CERN, and meaning that on some level right now the human race isn't in fact producing its own gravitational fields. The question now is scalability. And we know that space and time are related, and so I hate to
I'm learning. Go ahead. This is great.
we know that space and time are related. That's why they call it space-time, not just time. They're not just
It's
space.
a fabric.
That's right, and it is a
It's a
fabric.
wonderful word, space-time fabric. Everybody goes, what?
Right. And so the notion is that if you are in fact able to produce your own gravitational field that you can control, then what do you have if you can travel through space using your own gravitational field? Don't you also simultaneously have a time machine, such that if the gravitational field is strong enough that you could probably in fact travel into the future or into the past, depending on where you set your compass, I guess, however they steer those things. But one of the things that Ben Rich said to Jan Harzan, you've all heard this story, he said that there was an error in the equations. And Jan, as a nuclear engineer, would say, well, he thinks that the error in the equations is in Maxwell's equations. But that was what Ben Rich was trying to say, was that, look, we've already got this technology to be able to go to the stars. Well, how does it work? And the only thing that he said to Jan was there's an error in the equations. So what I simply wanted to point out is maybe it doesn't require the energy of an entire galaxy in order to produce a machine that moves through time. And it may very well be possible if we are at some point in the future. And I have to tell you that the people at the To the Stars Academy are absolutely confident that they will be able to do this very soon, to produce artificial gravitational fields such that it might very well be possible at some time, perhaps even in our own lifetimes, to travel into the future. One of the things that they told us was that you'll be able to wear a mechanism on your wrist, like a wristwatch, and you'll be able to press a couple of buttons on it and make a setting, and it'll open up a portal in space-time in front of you, and you'll be able to walk through it. And what they told us was that would be happening in the next 30 years.
Well, what that is, what we have it now, it's called falling asleep.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand. I mean, I don't make light of that. I mean, I understand the research and to the sense, to the point where I kind of get a certain level into that, and then I kind of let it go because I can't look at everything in that, you know. But I do. I
think
keep
if
an
you-
open mind, you know.
You really need to read some of Hal Puthoff's papers. He's written one that I can even understand on the metric tensor, where he talks about how this is very possible. I was very fortunate enough to have a conversation with Dr. Putoff a few months back, not knowing that he was working with, the To the Stars Academy and Eric Davis and all these folks. And I was very fortunate in that he sent me one of his most recent papers on the metric tensor and how that relates to the control of gravity and time. And I think these folks really are onto something. I think that between him and Eric Davis and some of the other folks that they've got work, especially when you get somebody there that's the director of the Skunk Works, former director of the Skunk Works, you know that there's a knowledge base there that's hard to surpass.
Yeah.
And the movement of UFO sightings kind of lends credibility to that, and many times people see it, they say it was here, and then it moved here, but they don't really see it moving from here to here. They just see it here, and then it was here, and then it was here. So maybe moving space-time, not traveling really fast. They're here, then they're here.
Yeah, and what they're
That's-
saying is
that's,
what they're saying is that these objects, and in particular, and I'll talk about this on Saturday when I talk about the Nimitz incident, but on when they ran into these objects, they called them tic tacs, and what they speculated, and this was not the first time they'd encountered these shape of objects, but they have reached the conclusion that objects that are shaped like that, a spherical object or a circular object likely has one gravity generator in the center of it, and then the tic tacs have two, and the way, one of the reasons they're able to draw these conclusions is by the signatures that come off of them. And so they think that basically the shape of these craft has nothing to do with how cool they look, it has to do with their functionality. So when you see a big long cigar-shaped object that might be, say, miles in length, that they think, and again this is just speculation, but they think that there are a series of these gravity generators along the length. There may be one in the center, two on the end, that sort of thing. When you have a triangular craft, those triangular craft have three of these gravity generators. The Tic Tac ones have two, and spherical and circular UFOs have one gravity generator in the center. They're simply speculating that, but it also has to do with the functionality of the craft. What is this craft used for? The smaller ones, the ones that are between 20 and 30 feet long, tend to be circular or spherical or disc shaped. And then as they get a little bit bigger and they start to have additional gravity generators depending on how large they are. But they do think that these things are actually being driven by some form of an artificial gravity generator, and the shape of the craft is based upon the functionality of the craft.
And Richard, what you're touching on, and that's the one question I get asked time and time again. You've cataloged hundreds of these triangular UFO reports. Why are they lighting these things up like Christmas trees? Quite often there's an array of lights, either on the side or on the bottom. But more often than not, the one common characteristic with many of these reports are the bright lights at each point of the triangle. And I speculate, but also based on some of the eyewitness reports and looking at the commonalities, that these lights are not lights as we think of them, like with FAA regulations. Obviously, if they're from somewhere else, they don't need to conform to our FAA regulations. I do believe that the lights, based on my research, are an inherent part of the propulsion system. It allows them to move in certain ways, and I would tend to agree that I've often likened these triangular platforms, these very large triangular platforms, in excess of 200-300 feet in some cases. Think of a three-legged table. If you have a three-legged table short of having one in the middle, you're going to have a leg at each point. And just like you mentioned with the gravity generator, Richard, I tend to agree with that idea that we're probably dealing with something that allows stability. But at the same time, quite often on the back end of these, and in the January 5th case that Mike is going to talk about, and I'll touch on as well, there's illumination towards the back. In fact, the one witness, the one police officer, Officer Ed Barton, now deceased, when he said that the object hyper-accelerated, much like Karen alluded to, where it was over here and then suddenly it was over here, he saw a burst of light, yet no sound, and this object went supersonic. We were able to calculate, because we had the police dispatch tapes that are time-stamped. We knew where the one officer saw it and where he was standing. I was on location with him. We know where the other officer was. We have distance, we have time, and then we can calculate an estimated speed. This object clearly went hypersonic, yet did not generate a sonic boom. But at the entire time, this object remained level, and the police officers described these 3 points of light. But there apparently is two propulsion systems in a sense. I think there's one that maintains it for vertical, and then there's the ability for it to jettison in different directions. I think there's two mechanisms at work there. And to Richard's point, you touch on this, and Colonel Alexander, who wrote the foreword of my book, John Alexander, with extensive military background, we don't design military aircraft based on appearance, as you said, Richard. And he said everything is based on a utilitarian perspective. What is this going to be used for, and how is it going to operate? And that is what typically dictates, and Mark would probably agree, the design of many military, if not all military craft that we develop.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think another point, because I've heard that same description that you've heard from ATIP personnel or from To the Stars. And another, I think, aspect that's interesting is they're looking at military UFO cases. And throughout the decades, even with Project Blue Book, even at Washington, D.C. in 1952, they were chasing little dots of light that would appear on radar. They would do fantastical maneuvers. When jets were scrambled, they were gone, or they would have a little bit of a dogfight, you know, cat and mouse kind of game, and then they would take off at extraordinary speeds. And as soon as the jets left, they would often come back. You can read many, many military records where they recorded these and they didn't figure out what happened, including right over the Capitol in 1952. And Project Blue Book was there to witness this. So especially if you look at the military cases, which ATIP, the Elizondo and his group looked at, you know, you could see why they would come to these sort of conclusions given what they observed.
Yeah. And one of the things I'll talk about is the many different hundreds of cases that they looked at, even though all we'll be talking about really is the Nimitz incident. But the gravity generator thing, one of the things that they told us was this is one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of pieces of these things, because of the collapse of the gravitational field. When these things are inside of a gravitational field and they're traveling through the atmosphere, just traveling, if the gravitational field collapses, the craft itself is obliterated almost down to the molecular level. Now, interestingly though, even though that happens when these gravitational fields collapse, the craft is completely destroyed, we are still able to collect some of that material. And that is some of the material that they were talking about that is in the possession of Bigelow Aerospace and Bob Bigelow down in Las Vegas. They were actually, I won't say that they told us that they have pieces of it, but it's pretty obvious that they do have pieces of these crafts. But one of the reasons that we don't have great big chunks of a lot of them is because of the way they're driven and the fact that when the gravitational fields collapse, the craft is almost completely destroyed down to the molecular level.
You know, everything I've been hearing for the last 10 minutes is something that is actually remarkably consistent with aerospace engineer Bob Schroeder's findings. He wrote a book called Solving the UFO Enigma. Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah.
Met with him.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. He's a really nice guy, and his contention is that UFOs are actually particle accelerators that are accelerating, and that's why they're circular in some cases, the triangular ones as well. He didn't specifically address like a gravity generator at the vertices, for instance, on these triangular craft. So that remains to be seen. Maybe there is, you know, maybe that's something. But I have no doubt we're witnessing something that is there for real, and I think that perhaps if Bob's right, I think he's on the right track. Okay, with maybe a little modification, maybe he's kind of going down the right path. Because in the propulsion method that they use, all of the reported visual effects that we see with our eyes are actually predictable in that propulsion theory. The blinking out and blinking out here and blinking in over there, the shimmering, changing colors. Okay, spectral shifts are also something that's actually predicted, you know, for this type of
The fuzziness of the images that they
the
take.
fuzziness, right? Well, yeah, exactly. You know, and so you know, whereas to me, it looks like a photo of a bad special effects model. That could actually just be the result of an effect caused by the physics of how they operate. You know, and I understand that. So, you know, we all have to keep an open mind. You're here because you have open minds. You know, and you love open minds. Sorry, I fucked him. He's a good guy. You don't get to see him because he's videoing all of us. And you don't see him.
I'm live streaming because Open Minds, we do a live video at 6 o'clock on Thursday, and I promised everybody I would do a live no matter what we were doing, and it turns out we were in the middle of the panel, just so people know who are watching at the Devils UFO Rendezvous. So with Richard Beckwith, Mark D'Antonio, Lee Spiegel, Micah Hanks, David Marler, and Karen Bryan, and me, Alejandro Rojas. Yay! So that's what this conversation has been about. I don't know, are there other questions for...
Answer his question about, oh, he's gone.
Let's see. We've got another question. What's your question?
Is there a considerable difference in numbers between the documented cases before the 70s, 80s, or after?
Okay, so she's asking, I think this is a great question because a lot of us are going over historical cases, and I know Karen is going over, these abduction cases, and we talked about and lots of these are during a period of time that is before the 70s. So the question was, is there a documented, difference between cases before the 70s and after the 70s? So maybe, Karen, I think what's interesting about what you're going to be talking about is the similarity in time frame.
I feel like there was a lot of good abduction cases that were studied that happened in the 70s. And I just don't feel that it's happening as much anymore, or because back then it wouldn't just be like, I think I've been abducted, and then I was regressed and they got me from my bed. These were, I saw a UFO, there's missing time, and then and I've had dreams of, I remember things.
And more multiple witness cases back then.
And several witnesses witnessing the same thing. Then later, when they're regressed, they're like, I can't tell you. They were given a post-hypnotic suggestion that I cannot tell you what happened, so that's why they don't remember, but eventually they can get it out. Maybe it's happening just as much now, but their technology's better, so they're not, maybe, they're totally blanking your mind out. But in my opinion, I think it happened a lot more back then. Maybe there was people visiting from another place and they had some kind of program, and maybe it lasted 10, 15 years, and maybe it's not really anything. They're moved on. Maybe they don't need to study us as much anymore. But that's just my opinion. Just from what I...
Well, the 70s was a period of time that was known as kind of the creatures, where there were a lot more sightings and very credible sightings with critters, entities. And these entities that were described in a couple cases I know Karen's going to cover is Travis Walton's case. Another popular case is the Allagash case. Another one is Pascagoula. And in all of these cases, you don't see the little gray aliens like we see on television. They're all very different, weird things that, it would be hard to even imagine, but they're credible cases in that there's multiple witnesses, and these all come from way back then.
I mean, like anywhere from like mid to early 50s to 1980, kind of, I think was a great majority of these group encounters. So maybe they're just not doing that anymore. I don't know.
So everybody think the same, that before the 70s, 80s, it was more documented cases, or what do you think?
Before the 70s?
It's a good question in the way, for example, when it comes to documented cases, the Air Force was documenting cases.
Well, so
And
avistamientos, I don't know how you call it in English, avistamientos, proof or...
proof. Yeah, well, that's the thing is, I think, and I'd love to hear the rest of the group. The Air Force was documenting cases. And that's the hard part. A lot of us, when we're doing our research, we're doing it out of our own pockets. Even if you belong to a large organization like MUFON, David, Mark, myself, I was a field investigator with MUFON and a director. A lot of times we're spending our own money to do it, so there's a limited resources. But the Air Force didn't have that limitation as much. So they were able to do more research, send people out, and that's why we have better records from when they were doing their investigations. Otherwise, there have been a couple other well-funded investigations. I would argue that Robert Bigelow, when he began researching in the 90s with an organization he called the National Institute of Discovery Sciences, they actually did produce some papers and some investigation they did, including a paper on triangular craft. And they had, credible scientists look into this, and they said, they decided we don't have anything like this in our inventory. These things have to be from somewhere else. So that would be an example of some good research. But otherwise, that's a reason why I feel there was better documentation in some of the cases early on than there is now.
If you look back in time, for people who made diaries, like nautical diaries, things were cited as far back as, there's been history, especially, people that have been out on the seas, they're out there looking all the time. They've reported things coming out of the ocean, things flying around that they couldn't explain, and this is back, 1600s.
Columbus.
The
Even
question
before that,
as
so.
it relates to cases, though, as far as quality, I think we also have to talk about quantity. But in doing that, frequency data is a really tricky subject when you talk about the UFO subject. And something that we have to consider is this. We estimate, and I think everyone would agree up here based on their experience, that only 1 out of every 10 UFO sightings is ever really officially reported. Whether that's to police, whether it's to MUFON or UFO investigators, or to newspaper reporters where it's actually documented in publications. But something beyond that, we have to look at the passage of time. I have a huge historical collection. I just recently acquired a collection from a researcher from the 1950s, and there's all of this documentation in the form of letters. And I think that's something we have to look at. We've seen a change in communication. Nowadays, anyone can fabricate or justifiably report a legitimate UFO sighting with zero cost to them. You can go online, you can post a report on the National UFO Reporting Center or MUFON, and it doesn't cost you anything. I mean, guess what? You can even do it anonymously. These old records that I have, these old case files, back in the 50s and the 60s, you had to handwrite or type a letter. You had to lick a stamp, so you have cost associated with that. Or if you're going to call in a report, it was usually a long distance phone call for us that remember those. And,
Cost associated with that.
so there's a cost associated with that. So you may not have had the large number of reports because it took time, it took a little bit of money to report a UFO sighting. Whereas today, technology's changed, and I don't know if that's for better or for worse. I often like to say that we have more quantity today of UFO reports, but less quality reports. And we've seen that change, but looking at patterns, and I'll use the triangular UFO as an example, just one example, and we could certainly look at different subsets of the data. The triangular reports weren't as prevalent, at least as it appears, in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, until the 70s. We started to see an increase, and then more specifically the 1980s. Today, it is almost the most widely, if not the most widely reported UFO. The flying saucer has almost gone out of date. It's been replaced with a newer model. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to talk about the reports and the number of reports over the years. But I always like to take a step back and say the nature of reporting UFOs has changed based on our technology. And those technologies may have made it easier or harder for individuals to report those actual cases.
Really quickly, also on the sociological side of things too, something else I think that you'll see is that attitudes toward UFOs change a lot over time, which is why it's so important. David does a lot of historical work, and he's looking at, firsthand, really what you call primary sources as a historical researcher. Letters and documents and correspondences between people. That was the primary way that a lot of researchers conducted their research back in the day. I mean, decades ago, they would collect a report, they would talk to somebody, or they would file a report of something that they themselves may have been studying or observed. They write a letter, they send that correspondence to somebody, and they may wait days, weeks, or even months to hear back from the person. These days, I could shoot David an email, and he could respond within minutes, and that's the speed of technology. So, again, I think that with the advent of the web in the early 1990s, you see a lot of information about UFOs. In fact, that was one of the most popular subjects on the early web in the early 1990s. I have a friend in Asheville, North Carolina, who's a longtime newspaperman, and he said, literally there were websites that saw that there was a potential for, I think a lot of popularity and therefore monetization online. So they were hiring people to write about UFOs and kind of, fringe ideas and things like this, so that we could get information on the web that people would go look at, and then we could draw traffic to our new websites, But with that also came the reporting aspect and the communication aspect. So more people were communicating about the subject. They were able to do so more quickly. And more people were, again, through the ease of access of reporting, were filing with MUFON, filing with, investigative committees. We didn't have APRO at that time. NICAP, well, the NICAP files are still online, but there are other civilian UFO groups. And really, tell you the truth, National Institute for Discovery Science was one of those. It was just not a public kind of a group, but they didn't release information publicly. That was Bob Diggle. So the long story short is, you have to also look at the way that technology changes things and the way that people were able to file or receive information, and then also cultural attitudes as it relates to other media. Really quickly, 1973, that's come up a couple of times in this conversation. Pascagoula, you had a lot of, right there in the early 1970s, through the mid-1970s, popular accounts of aircraft, taking people aboard the aircraft and doing examinations. Travis Walton comes from that era. And of course, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were the two from Pascagoula, Mississippi, that were reported, and we've discussed a couple of times tonight. There's this idea that little green men or gray men, with big heads and big eyes are on board these craft. If you look at any of those different cases, the popular ones from the 70s, there's very little consistency between beings associated with those aircraft. It wasn't until the 80s and 90s with the publication of two primary books, Intruders by Bud Hopkins and Communion by Whitley Strieber, that we really start having this cultural narrative emerge, where we have the alien gray that's featured on the cover of Communion. Interestingly, the newer versions of that book don't have that same iconic cover. I don't know why they changed it. Even more interestingly is that with the advent of the new millennium, many statisticians and people who look very technically at the data associated with UFO reports will tell you there seem to be fewer reports of abductions, landed craft interactions with entities, but people still see a technological presence in the skies, which they call UFOs. So in terms of how things have changed and whether information is collected differently or if there's better information, I would say that interestingly, we do seem to see a more technical move toward understanding this phenomenon. A little less hearsay and a little less of the mythos of the abductee, not to diminish those reports by any means. But I do think that the sociological aspect of that, as well as the technological, has to be taken into consideration in order to understand why those changes occur over time.
To Micah's point, I just acquired a huge international collection of UFO files, former files from the Soviet Union, as well as a number of files from South American countries. What you find when you look globally at these reports, and also I would even reference the works of Maurizio Verga, who is an Italian UFO researcher who analyzed the 1954 wave of UFO sightings, both in Italy as well as France. And when you look at those reports, to Micah's point, you do not have this homogenized little gray alien that's being reported. There is a variety of entity reports, alien reports. And unfortunately, I think we as UFO community, and I don't mean us here, but documentary groups and productions that draw on us for information, they sometimes put out that thought that they all conform to this one little gray alien, and it's not the truth. It's a wide variety of descriptions of entities, just like it's a wide variety of UFOs being reported. And when you look, there is such a variety, especially in the French and the Italian sightings from the wave from 1954. And South American cases are vastly divergent. In fact, Orange, Russia, the famous Russian case from 1989, they describe these like 10-foot tall giants that were reported by children and even adults, although usually the skeptics say it was just children that saw it. There were actually adult witnesses also that saw these things.
I was going to suggest, the transition from, say, circular saucers to triangles could be more than a sociological change, for instance, but it could also be due to the fact that a different group was visiting us and was using different technology anyway, and that has to be said. I mean, you were alluding to it, both of you. So I think that's a strong possibility that we've had visitation from different groups, because there isn't just maybe one other species that's advanced in our galaxy. Okay, there's probably a whole lot of others, and they would have probably arrived at interstellar travel from different points and probably developed different technologies to utilize the same principle. The universe has the same template for all of us, right? We just have to find it. We found it, but it's too far away for us to use right now. Okay, so we're there. Other groups that were here, long before us, Earth's only 4.6 billion years old. The galaxy existed for over 9 billion years before that, before we were coalesced out of a nebula. So clearly, the opportunity for other development has happened. You know, we've seen planets. We've actually found an exoplanet that's 12.6 billion years old. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. So clearly, planetary formation has been happening since nearly the beginning of the universe. So it stands to reason that another group came along and has accelerated. They survived the technological hurdles, like we're trying to. And if they did, then maybe they're out there, you know, applying the universe in a different type of technology, different design, different look. And maybe the triangle is a different look. Showed up here. Why would they show up here? That's the big question people ask. Why show up here? Well, what are we doing? We're searching for life like us. Okay? Carbon-based, oxygen breathing. Okay? The big signal isn't that there's humans on this planet. The big signal is that there's oxygen in our atmosphere. And guess what? We're on the verge of being able to see that in exoplanet atmospheres. When the James Webb Telescope goes up, okay, I keep saying next year. I said that 4 years ago. Okay, it's late. It's late.
Progress takes time.
It's late. But if we can detect oxygen in an atmosphere, well, guess what? Oxygen doesn't like to be in an atmosphere. I'll talk about that also on Saturday. Oxygen doesn't want to be in an atmosphere. It wants to bind up with stuff. Mars is red because it rusted. I know, it's crazy, but the iron compounds in Mars absorb the oxygen from the atmosphere as the H2O molecules that used to be in the atmosphere were broken apart by the harsh sunlight, getting through the end, because there was no magnetic field at that point on Mars. That all said, when we only had, when we look at the Earth, we see oxygen, it means something's replenishing that oxygen. Now, there are geological processes that can do that, but not this extensively. So clearly, what's replenishing oxygen here is life. And other creatures elsewhere, looking at the entire panoply of planets out there. What? Panoply of planets? I gotta remember that. The panoply of planets. It's also a tongue twister. Seeing that panoply of planets out there, they probably would look for oxygenated atmospheres. And they would say, let's go there. There's probably life there. So we stand out. Now, we are not just a pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan says, okay? We're actually a loudly screaming blue dot. From any distance elsewhere in the universe, we can see planets tens of thousands of light years away. And so can everybody else, in my opinion. So they will have seen us because we stand out like a sore thumb. We have a brilliant oxygen atmosphere that's on display for the entire universe to see. And they're coming here. They are coming here.
And lots of liquid water.
That doesn't, oxygen in the atmosphere will guarantee liquid water to some extent if it's in the habitable zone. So yes, it all fits together like a great puzzle piece.
All right, so we were supposed to go, I think, till 8 o'clock. I've got to step out right now, but if you guys want to continue, or we can begin to mingle for a bit for the rest. Go for it. I'm going to take everything with me.
Oh, so make sure you shut that off.
Potty break.
The bathroom.
Yeah. Good idea.
Thank you, Alejandro.
Thanks. Okay, everybody, so that was our Q&A section on the opening day here at the Devils Tower UFO Rendezvous. Some of you had some questions in there. Sorry we couldn't all get to them. So for instance, some of them you were talking about the solar observatory. Now I'm going to warn you, of course, when anything happens that seems a little bit strange, the regular people are going to come out of the woodwork and of course claim that something fantastical took place that only they know about. Unfortunately, well, either way, that was not the case in this situation. Here's the problem with the idea that, there's some kind of major cover-up, and that is that the solar observatory is just one observatory looking at the sun. There's many of them. If there was something going on, then all of these observatories would have seen it and they would all need to be shut down. So we did talk about that in this panel earlier, and someone made the point that this happened near White Sands, and this sort of thing happens quite a bit near White Sands, meaning that, see, someone says 7 sun observatories now down. I have not seen that anywhere, so I'd love for you to give us a link of some credible information saying that, because that has not been, I haven't seen that anywhere. It's just been one. I don't have to Google it. You Google it. and then send that to us. Because the problem is, often if you look at these sources, they're not credible sources. And so sources are everything. But anyway, getting back to everything, that's why this solar thing is probably not as big of a deal as everybody's talking about, at least as hiding some sort of major secret of some sort of aliens around the sun or something like that. So be careful of sources and where you get your information. But anyway, I'm going to have more interviews. I know that this wasn't optimal as far as the audio and the video, and the reason why is because, you know, this was kind of a last minute. I just wanted to, like I said, you know, honor my commitment of trying to get you guys something live every Thursday at 6. And since this was kind of fun to be here amongst all of these great researchers, I figured that you all would love to hear what they have to say. And I think we got some pretty interesting conversation on this live stream. So anyway, keep an eye out on Open Minds and on this live, or at least on our YouTube, because I'm going to get more video of interviews with these researchers, and they'll be better. They'll be with microphones and with cameras, and it'll be all set up, and it'll be really nice, and I hope you guys enjoy it. But thank you all so much for being here again, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Now I've got to go offline because I'm going to interview George Knapp for the next podcast. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Talk to you guys later. Adios, muchachos. Let's see if I can figure out how to